Hello YouTube. So last night I went through and rewired the entire dashboard on this car so that it could accept a digital instrument cluster. I also finished rewiring the Traveler computer. So now I'm going to show you how you would go ahead and install this Traveler computer. So first thing we're going to need to do is get our trusty toolbox, and we're going to need a Phillips head screwdriver. The way these trim pieces come off in this car is actually quite simple. They just pop out like that. They're held in with clips like these, and that holds them together. Now, this panel, you'll notice, does not have a bar going down along this area across. That's important. Bear that in mind for later. We're also going to want to take out this piece down here, which again just comes out like that, and the piece surrounding all of the climate control and stereo and cigarette lighter and everything. In my case, I'm going to want to eject this tape that's in here, so I'm going to turn the key on, press the eject button, pop that tape out of there for now, and turn the key back in the unlock position. Now we'll remove this trim piece. Now that all of those are removed, you're going to need to remove the following screws. These two here, well, there's one in there you have to take the fuse box cover off of. There's one down here, just below and to the left of the brake release. There are two more on the right hand side underneath the dash. You're also going to need to remove this unleaded fuel only piece. There are two screws there holding it in. You're going to remove all of those. You're also going to need to remove the unleaded fuel only piece. Be careful with that one, it can be tricky. You'll also need to remove the headlamp switch. There are 3 screws holding it in. So with this open, you can see this little green cable. When I move the shifter column, you can see how that cable gets pulled. That is to the gear selector indicator. You have to have this in the lowest gear in order to unwrap it. So now we're going to remove the screws that hold in the instrument cluster itself. There's one here, there's one up here, there's one up here, there's one over here. Now that the screws are removed, the cluster itself is ready to pull out. And you have to be careful with this as well. You want to gently work the cluster out. Reach your hands back here and feel for 2 cylinder type plugs. At least on the AA body cars, there are 2 cylinder like plugs that feel ribbed. So we're going to just gently pull on that, and you'll feel it pop off. And then there's going to be the other cylinder like plug on the other side of the cluster, which we're going to reach in and pull off as well. So those are popped off now. So now you just have to gently work the cluster out. Now the cluster's removed. These are the 2 what I called ribbed feeling cylinder shaped plugs that go and hook up to the back of the analog cluster. In order to use a digital cluster, you have to wire in these pigtails that work with the instrument, with the digital cluster. So if you do go to a junkyard to find one of these cars with a digital cluster to do this conversion, be sure to grab the pigtails, and be sure to grab as much length of these wires as you can. So, actually there's a car going by. So what I do is I'll get the pinouts, and they're readily available online. And as I mentioned in another video, and I kind of show how this works in another video as well, is you want to splice these wires. You don't want to cut them, but you want to splice them. And if you have the pinouts, it's helpful, but many times the wires simply match up in color anyway. So for example, here we have a white orange and a white orange. That's the speed. You have green, which is for the left turn signal. You've got the other connector here, you've got red and blue, which is generally the ignition switch feed. You got the blue, which is this dark blue, which my index finger's touching right now. That's the fuel level. Black and pink is the check engine light. Tan is the right turn signal. Gray is the oil pressure switch. So on and so forth. Basically, you take each one of these wires, and using a pair of wire splicers, I'll show you the kind that I use. These are the kind of wire splicers that I personally use. I like these a lot because you don't have to feed wire in through the handle. You can get them right up through the top. You've also got cutters there, should you need them. But primarily you want to just splice these wires. That way you can tie on any additional links that you may need, or just the plain wires themselves directly to the main harness, and then just use electrical tape with nice tight wraps to seal it off. It's fairly simple. It's easier if you have the color pinouts. I've gone and done cluster conversions where I did not have the original pigtails, but they were the same connector type. So that can get confusing in a hurry when you're looking at wire colors that aren't actually the wire colors. Then you have to go by the pin number, and you have to try to memorize which one does what, and try to match it up. And when you're in that kind of a situation, it really is best to have the pinouts. You've got to have the pinouts, really, especially on the digital cluster. You can trace the circuit board on the analog ones to kind of figure out what wire does what. If you look at the back of the analog gauge cluster, here's the analog cluster that was in here, and you can kind of see more or less where the pins go and more or less what they're going to do. So it's pretty self-explanatory. I once did that because I couldn't get the wire colors out of a New Yorker. That was my very first digital cluster swap. I couldn't get the pinouts for the analog ones, so I just traced every wire by hand on this printed circuit board and figured it out manually. I did have the pinouts for the digital cluster at the time, though. But anyway, you kind of get the idea. It looks like a rat's nest of cables. It pretty much is. But anyway, let's go ahead and put the new gauge cluster in there. Okay, so now here we have the digital gauge cluster for this car. What we're going to do, and you can see that it bolts up a little bit differently, but the bolts it does line up, and there are actually places to put these two top bolts. Now, before you get any further than this, and probably before you even put those bolts in, you're probably going to want to turn the key on and make sure that everything is actually working. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay. So everything seems to be lighting up. functioning as we expect. What you're going to want to do is make sure that all of the various functions are functioning. So try your turn singles. Those are working. High beam light is working. We've got our shift lever indicator is working. That's good. If we turn on the headlights, good. It dims the way it's supposed to. It dims all the way to very dim for us, and it will come back up. We got the click set. That's another thing I'm going to show you that you need to look at. When you go to remove the headlamp switch, you can get constant battery feed for your instrument cluster from here on this red and white wire, and you can get panel illumination for full brightness on the first click counterclockwise on this pin here, where this is wired up. That only applies if you have the headlamp switch out of either a LeBaron or a Spirit or an Acclaim that had the Traveler computer built in. That pin can be used to turn panel illumination to full brightness for both the Traveler and the digital instrument cluster. You can hook up the digital instrument cluster to the ignition feed from the gauge cluster wire harness for both the constant battery feed and the ignition switch feed. However, every time you turn the key off, your trip is going to reset. So if you plan on using the trip, definitely hook up the constant battery feed. When it comes to the Traveler computer, you should definitely hook up the constant battery feed. It's very easy to pin into it from the stereo. If you don't, it's going to reset every time you turn the key off, and that isn't going to do you much good as far as your average fuel economy, your distance traveled, your trip. So definitely hook that one up to the constant battery feed. I'll put the remaining 2 screws in to hold in the top of the cluster so that it just doesn't rattle on us. We don't want it to rattle. That's all back together now. Good. Now we can work on putting the panel back up. So now that we've got this under part bolted back up, we can put the fuse box cover back on. And we also want to put this piece back on again. It's much easier to do in the 90 with the digital cluster than it is with the analog one. So now that everything is bolted back together again, now it's time to put the trim pieces back on. So start on the right, or the left, doesn't really have a restart. That goes there. This one goes over there. And now, the interesting part. Remember earlier how I pointed out about this? You can't really use this one because this cluster lays back in here further and it doesn't quite line up with the cluster. That's because the bearings that had the digital cluster used a different trim piece. This trim piece right here lays further deeper into the bay and has the right opening for the digital cluster. So if you're going to do this swap, you really should get the correct bezel. This bezel, like the others, just pushes right up in, snaps into place. Vents work and everything. Put the cigarette lighter back in. Now we can set the speedometer back up and let's start it up. And it works. All of the gauges are working. Various lights are working. So let's take her for a spin around the block and see if all of the gauges are working. It looks like they are. The speedometer is working. Get the air going. It's hot in here. getting old, but they are working. Alright, YouTube, thank you so much for watching. You all have a wonderful day. Thumbs up if you like it, thumbs down if you didn't. Please subscribe, and I will see y'all next time. Thank you so much.